Why do you need a podcast? Why do you want to talk to people? Why do you think you should start a podcast? My name is Oluwaseun Olatunji, and in today's video, I'll be answering that question for you and many more. Stick with me to the end of this video so you get every bit of information I've put together in this video. So why do you need a podcast? You see podcast here, left and right, everybody is saying something out there. It's because there are audience for this and podcast is making wave. So in 2024, next year, you might want to consider starting a podcast. Podcasts are very simple and easy to create and produce. One special thing about podcast is that as long as you are able to speak, as long as you are verbal, you can start a podcast. All we need to do is to be able to hear you. If you want to go extra mile and make a video podcast, then that's a different thing. But podcast generally, we just need to hear you. Your language don't even matter. You can make podcast in your mother's tongue or even your native tongue, as long as there are people in the world who speak and understand that language, then you have a potential audience. So there is audience for you. It doesn't mean you have to speak good English or have good English accent or speak Spanish. There is an audience for you. All you need to be able to do is to speak. Podcasts come in different forms. It could come in form of interviews where you interview other people. It could come in form of chit chat with your friends where you're discussing about a subject matter. It could be a detailed pre-recorded report. It could be analysis. It could be anything. Podcast is limitless. So what does the stats say? What statistics do we have about podcasts? I don't want to bore you with too many stats in this video. But in 2022, in the United States of America, there were 200 million plus active podcast listeners. What does that tell you? There is a large audience for podcast listeners. Another stat about podcasts is that 32% of podcast listeners listen to podcasts in the car. So it could be their personal car, it could be their in transit on a public car. They listen to it in the car because podcasts are usually long and podcasts are mostly audio. So there are video podcasts, but podcasts are mostly audio. So when it's audio, people can plug in their earpiece, their earbud, their car tape, their headset, and then they listen to it even while in transit. Another fact about podcasts is that there is listener for every age group. Between the age of 13 to 35, there are 36% listeners. Now, between the age of 35 to 54, there are 34% listeners. And of course, there is 30% listeners that are above 50. That means there are listeners at every age group. That means you can make podcasts and talk to the younger generation, to the middle-aged generation, and the older generation. So this is not a matter of it's only the youths who listen to podcasts. This is not a matter of it is only the kids who listen to podcasts. This is not an issue of the older ones don't listen to podcasts. So what does that mean? Regardless of your age and your topic, there are listeners out there for you. You can get your audience out there. Let me go. What are the benefits of making a podcast? What do you benefit from making a podcast? I'm going to mention 5 in this video. There are lots of them. The list is exhaustible, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to mention 5 benefits you get from making a podcast. So number 1 is that there is a huge potential audience for you. The audience out there is big. They are looking for someone that will say something that they enjoy or they are interested in. And once you are able to carve out this audience, you are able to gain their trust. Even with your small audience, you can monetize them. Nobody is saying you have to get 1 billion listeners before you can. No, even with your small audience, you can monetize them. You get sponsored ads, you can get equipment, gadgets owners sponsoring you. People can pay you to talk about their product. You can do merch sales. You can do a lot of things with podcasts. I have a friend who's called Edmond Oris, and his podcast, Vibe with Edmond Oris, once ranked number 1 in Nigeria, number 1 in Ghana, and number 4 in Africa. Edmond made sales also from merch. So when his friends began to wear it, and some of his listeners began to wear it, people began to see, oh, what is this show? What is this podcast all about? And indirectly, he began to promote his own podcast by even sales of his merch. Podcasting. So number 2, there is a global reach for you. It's not until you're in the United States of America or you're in Canada before people can hear you. As long as you have something interesting to say and people out there understand your language, then you are limitless and people can hear you all over the world. Imagine being in a location and then people even beyond the shores of your continent can hear you. That's massive. And number 3 is that it is easy and it is budget friendly. You don't need the big lights. You don't need the nice background. You don't need sophisticated gadgets. You don't need the Sony 4K cameras. You don't need a lot of things. You can speak to your phone even directly without having any audio equipment. If you are in a louder or noisier environment and you want to make a finer audio quality, you can even use the earpiece or your earbuds or your AirPods or whatever listening gadgets that you've got that's got a microphone that you can speak into. So you don't need a big studio, you don't need much space. Very easy to do, and it is budget friendly. Then number 4, it allows you to make long form content. Unlike the TikTok where they give you dimension of 3 9:16 vertical short form video, 3 seconds, 30 seconds. No, in podcast you can speak for as long as possible, as long as you can keep your audience entertained, as long as you can keep them informed, as long as you have audience retention. Imagine if you've got 4 speakers on your podcast and each of them needs to talk about a certain topic and then they need to make their final conclusion about it. You would not even get that done in 30 minutes. Trust me, you would spend more than 30 minutes. And on the average, most podcasts between 30 minutes and 50 minutes. It doesn't mean you can't go longer. You can go longer. I've listened to a podcast of 3 hours. It's worth it. They gave me good value, and that was why I sat and I listened to it for 3 hours. So podcast allows you to make long form content. And lastly, number 5 is, guess what? It gives you a brand voice. You can position as a brand and it gives you a voice. Now, one thing is you would notice a lot of radio presenters, a lot of OAPs, they've got large audience on social media even when they are not active on that platform. Because outside the social media, they got a voice. Outside Twitter, X, Instagram, they have a voice. So when people listen to them, they want to see them on social media as well. So even if they are not consistent, even if they post pictures once in a week, they still have that large audience because they have a voice. And then whatever you say will begin to matter, will begin to count, because you have people who actively listen to you and some people who follow what you say. You begin to gain influence. You position yourself as a brand. That's the 5th benefit of making a podcast that I've mentioned in this video. In my subsequent videos, I'm going to make a video on how to start a podcast, and I'm going to make another video on how to monetize your podcast. Thank you so much for watching so far. If you have gained 1 or 2 things from this video, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, turn on my notifications so that when I drop other videos, you will be duly notified. If you've got questions and contributions, and delve with you in the comment section. And don't forget, be good if you can be good. If you can't be good for any reason, don't get caught. See you when I drop my next video. Bye.